Good evening, and welcome to this virtual program, Listening to World War II Voices from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I'm Marcia Eli, the Director of Programs for the Center for Brooklyn History. Many of you have long known us as the Brooklyn Historical Society, and so if this change is news to you, I'm happy to share that we are now a center of the Brooklyn Public Library. This means so many things. It means that our combined collections truly do give you the largest collection of Brooklyn-related materials on the planet. And it also means that our public programs join the many offerings that the library brings to you through its programming arm, BPL Presents. I hope that you all check out the events at BPL Presents, including the ones at Center for Brooklyn History, and join us for many, many, many evenings in the future. Tomorrow is Veterans Day. It's a time when we pause to acknowledge the men and women who have served their country in the United States Armed Forces. At the Center for Brooklyn History, where we've recently completed processing an extraordinary collection of oral histories from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Veterans Day has us thinking quite a bit about the home front, specifically Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Navy Yard during World War II. And so this program takes a look at World War II through the lens of those really intimate and personal and powerful stories and voices that now are online for anyone to listen to on their own computers, at their own homes, at any time. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to encourage all of you to chime in tonight. Please send your comments, your questions, type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the program. And now I am truly delighted to introduce Andrew Gustafson, who is a co-founder of Turnstile Tours, which leads all of the tours, historic tours at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and is our moderator this evening. Andrew, thank you and welcome.
Hi, Marcia. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really excited for this program. This has been a subject that I've been working on for the last several years, and have had the wonderful opportunity over those many years to engage with these oral histories and even conduct some of the oral histories. But I'm so excited for this panel that we have today that's going to talk about not only the people and their stories, but also really the process of creating this incredible collection. I did just want to mention a couple of housekeeping things for those of you who are watching. First of all, we do have closed captioning. So if you'd like to turn that on or off, you can do it down at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining us from a mobile device or a tablet, you may have to exit out of the session and go into the settings to turn the captioning on or off. The other thing too is we're going to be listening to many different clips from the oral history collection. Some of them might be a little bit hard to understand. Some of the people were quite elderly when we interviewed them, but I think the spirit and the story comes through. And also some of them will have some edits in there. So if you hear that, it's not necessarily something wrong with your sound. But I want to introduce our wonderful panel. First, I want to introduce Mary Mann, who co-processed the oral history collection earlier this year. And she's a member of the Information Access Collective Prison Library Support Network and author of the book Yawn, Adventures in Boredom. And she's also a researcher. So Mary, welcome.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course. And we also have Amy, who led the processing of this collection. And we'll talk about how this collection was long in the making. And we're so happy that it is finally processed in this wonderful condition to share with the world. Before joining the Brooklyn Historical Society, she was a project archivist at NYU's Division of Libraries. And she's currently an archivist at the Center for Brooklyn History. So Amy, welcome.
Hi, Andrew. I'm very excited to talk about this collection.
Yeah. And we also have Sadie Sullivan, who was the lead interviewer from 2008 to 2010. And she was the director of oral history at the Brooklyn Historical Society from 2006 to 2014. Sadie's currently studying semantics for white racial justice organizers and exploring ways to encourage more embodied storytelling by bringing movement, sound, and deep listening to her oral history work. So Sadie, since you have been involved in this project the longest, I want to start with you and tell us a little bit about how creating the Brooklyn Navy Yard Oral History Collection started.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to be here and so happy to see the collection so beautifully cared for and made available to anyone who is curious to listen through the oral history portal. It's when you're collecting oral histories, that's the hope. And so it's really nice to see that that is carried on. So yeah, this project actually was the seed of the idea came from the novelist Jennifer Egan way back in 2006. She had begun doing research about the waterfront. She was interested in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. She was interested in people working in the yard during World War II, specifically women. All of that research, you all know, culminated in the book Manhattan Beach, which came out in 2017. And back in 2006, that research was just beginning. And so she on her own started making connections to interview some people who she knew who had worked in the yard during the World War II years. And she connected with an archivist, Daniela Romano, then at Brooklyn Navy Yard, who was, getting those archives together with Meredith Wisner, really making possible what we now know as Building 92 and all the wonderful resources there. And Brooklyn Navy Yard and Center for Brooklyn History, then Brooklyn Historical Society, with Jennifer Egan's spark of an idea, decided to partner to really focus on collecting oral history narratives with people, mostly women, but also other folks who worked in the yard during World War II.
And Jennifer Egan's voice is one of the other voices we'll hear in some of the clips as well. I should mention, we'll also hear your voice as well, Sadie.
Yeah, and also I think interestingly, there was a collection from the 80s, 1986 to 1989. So we weren't the first to be looking at, the really, groundbreaking, glass ceiling breaking things that were happening in the yard. They were interested in that in the 80s as well. So I think we hear at least one from the 80s too.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that introduction to this project. I want to turn it over to Amy and Mary, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how the next phase went of actually digitizing the whole thing and making it available to the public.
Sure. Well, I have to credit Mary for doing pretty much most of the heavy lifting here, because part of the processing really involved a lot of auditing and listening to every single one of these interviews. And it's sort of a painstaking process sometimes. And Mary did an excellent job, and she did a lot of these interviews. We actually processed a total of 49 interviews. And they were a combination of the interviews from the 80s and from the 2006-2010 group that Sadie mentioned. And that it involved listening to the interviews, doing an audit, and then creating transcripts, and then syncing them through an OHM's synchronization system, and then we served it up online. So that's what, when you click on our oral history portal links, which will show up, that's what you're seeing is the end product of that. And then we also created a finding aid together.
A lot of fun. Honestly, we were doing this, in the early days of the pandemic. And so it was like, just got to be in another time and place for a little bit. Like Brooklyn was also having problems and they survived. So that was nice.
Yes, there are a lot of parallels between what we were kind of like what we were hearing and what we were living. So that was kind of amazing.
And that's something that really comes through in a lot of the clips we're going to listen to. The oral histories, they teach us not only about what was happening at the yard, but give us the broader context for what was happening in Brooklyn and across the country in World War II. So we're going to dive right in. We have a number of clips to share with you, and a number of people who participate in this project that we want to profile. Again, we want to acknowledge that tomorrow is Veterans Day, so we're going to listen to a number of people who were veterans, but we're also going to listen to people who contributed to the war effort in other ways, principally civilian workers at the yard. So I'm going to pull up our first clip right here. And so this is Audrey Lyons. Mary, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about Audrey.
Yeah. Well, she grew up in Cypress Hills neighborhood of Brooklyn, which is out east and kind of almost in Queens. And while working as a parts inspector at the yard, which is over on the East River, she was also taking night classes at Brooklyn College, which is way down south. So she's commuting all the time via this enormous triangle. She was doing her homework in transit. She usually didn't get home until 10 or 11 o'clock. So this clip is about sort of that experience of commuting, specifically late at night.
Great, thanks. Oh.
Anything we would like to add that we haven't touched on?
Well, one thing that I remember so well of those days, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was going to Brooklyn College and then home late at night. And we would have air raids, air raid sirens, tests, and everything would go black. The buses, everything had to stop. The buses would stop right where they were. Everything went black, and everybody would have to get off the bus and stand in a doorway. And it could be anywhere. I mean, we went through some really bad neighborhoods to get to where I lived. And all of a sudden it would go off. You'd have to get out of the bus and stand in these doorways like this for about 5 minutes until they'd have the all clear.
And everything would be dark.
Everything was black, everything. You had to put black things on your windows.
Wow.
So at home.
And where was the siren coming from?
Well, they were all over. They had them, wherever. Probably every couple of blocks there was some.
And how often would that happen?
Oh, quite a bit.
Wow.
And it's in the middle of the war, they did that quite a lot because they wanted people to be prepared. Just like in Britain, they actually got it, but we never got it.
So again, that other voice that you hear there is Jennifer Egan, and I think this also gives us some insight into her process of the tremendous detail of daily life that she tried to learn from these people. And I think Audrey was one of her really key informants for the book, and informed a lot of the scenes and the characters in that. So I love this clip because it's such a, just a little slice of daily life. Oh, it's, air raids. Oh, we got to black everything out. So Audrey, again, is, if you've read Manhattan Beach, she's certainly a person who, if you listen to her oral history, you'll definitely recognize sort of her voice and some, of her activities in the book as well. But we have another person here that I want to move to, again, kind of talking about the daily conditions of working in the yard. And again, we're talking about the Brooklyn Navy Yard in World War II as a period of tremendous transformation, both in terms of the size and scale of the work being done at the yard, but also in terms of the workforce. New people being given new opportunities to work in the yard and work in these production jobs. So Amy, tell us a little bit about Lucille Kolkin.
Sure. So Lucille Kolkin worked as a tack welder at the Navy Yard and grew up in Borough Park and Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. She attended Hunter College and started working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in the early 1940s at the age of 23. While she was in the yard, she worked there for about 2 years, and this oral history interview occurred on March 16th, 1989. So it's with that early group of interviews. And at the time of the interview, Lucille was approximately 70 years old.
And I just have a question here, which is, in a lot of these clips and these slides, we'll see other kind of ephemera related to these people. And Lucille is someone who is quite well, her life, at least during the war, is quite well documented in the collection.
Yes, yes. We have this badge, which you see here. We also have some letters that she wrote with her husband, Alfred, which we may see a little bit of later.
Yeah, yeah. So let's hear from Lucille as she talks about what were the physical conditions like for coming in and working as a welder.
Did you enjoy the work?
Well, I did and I didn't. I can't say, it was exciting. The whole idea of it was exciting. The physical conditions were very rough, and I must say I wasn't crazy about the cold or the heat. We stood on things that were very uncomfortable all day, 10 hours a day. They had it was like a square. All of this is metal, and it had to be big enough to put in with a metal pin to hold work in place. And you stood on this, and it was very uneven. It was terrible on the feet, and my feet became very bad. And I just found in one of the letters I wrote at that time that I said that the chiropodist had said, if I continue with this, really just ruin my feet completely. And they were really pretty bad at the time. And I remember once or twice stealing away to soak my feet into something while I was working there. I just couldn't stand it anymore,
Because there were a lot of physical dangers.
It wasn't, the dangers and the,
discomforts.
right, absolutely. It was very uncomfortable. And then, you started very early in the morning, or you quit very early in the morning, like 4 or 5 in the morning, so that, you had a lot of weather to contend with. And
How many hours a week did you work?
58.
So we obviously get a lot of detail there about the working conditions, how many hours she worked, what kind of the task was like. But you also kind of get her attitude about it as well. Not the most glamorous work. And Sadie, I want to turn it to you because obviously when you're doing oral history, the context in which you're doing that oral history and maybe the focus of the interviewer can often drive what comes out.
Definitely, yeah. Oral history is such a dynamic of the narrator, the interviewee, and the interviewer, and the context in which the interview is being collected. And it always struck me as interesting that the interviews with Navy Yard folks in the 1980s definitely had a labor history focus or interest, and in particular a worker safety focus or interest, and which was pretty different from the lens that Jennifer Egan and folks from Brooklyn Navy Yard in the early 2000s and us from Brooklyn Historical Society in the early 2000s, our focus was much more curious and celebratory, and we had seen how things like Rosie the Riveter of the airplane builders on the West Coast had been celebrated, and so we were interested in the women who were welding on shipbuilding in the Brooklyn Navy Yard at the same time, and so shipbuilding and ship repair. And so our approach, even though we were talking about a lot of the same similar details, like what kind of safety equipment did you use? What kind of boots did you wear? How did you find boots that fit women that were work boots with steel toes? The way that we were asking those questions, I think, did tend to, the responses were, just a different tone, which is really interesting for anyone using oral history collections as a resource, is to be aware of that, the context in which they were collected.
Yeah, and especially as we approach, patriotic anniversaries and things like that, it often sort of puts that more, triumphal, patriotic spin on things. I think that's so interesting. But it wasn't always glorious working at the Navy Yard, and sometimes it was just plain boring, which again, it's wonderful to have these details that you don't get, from the official record. So Mary, I'm going to pull up our next person here, who's Mimi Leipzig, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, so Mimi was born in Crown Heights. Her dad had a pharmacy on Prospect between Classen and Franklin. And she started working at the yard kind of right after getting married. She married this photographer, Arthur Leipzig. And one of the things that she talks about in her interview that I love so much is this sort of burning desire that she and all these other young people that she grew up with and knew felt to just help. They just wanted to help with the war effort, but there was nothing really to do. And so they're collecting newspapers because someone told them to do that, and it wasn't actually that useful, but they're still doing it because they just want to help. And so this clip is kind of about how that kind of manifested at the yard. You know, they're building Navy ships at the Navy Yard, but anyone who's at a government job knows that often there's a lot of extra personnel.
Yeah, and that's also something you find in kind of the memoirs. Arthur Miller was someone who worked at the yard, and he talks a lot about that. And as I say all the time, the history of the Navy Yard, it was created, in 1801, just as much for building ships as it was a make work program. So you see that even in World War II. So we'll listen to this clip here from Mimi.
But there was an awful lot of standing around and waiting that I remember too, which is why I think, like a lot of other things during the war, that it's like the collecting of papers, that the Navy had to, supposedly we had to get things done, but we were hanging around doing nothing. And we would complain, and that caused a lot of trouble.
Who would you complain to?
Well, we'd complain to the supervisor or the boss. You had to have a lot of guts to do that. Once in a while, one of us would do it. And then it would cause all the way down the line, it would cause a problem. Because that's not the way you work in a factory. You hang around and wait. So I know there was an awful lot of doing nothing.
Mimi is one of those people. She actually talks quite a bit in her oral history kind of about starting trouble, so to speak. And whether she's talking about this or talking about trying to get bathrooms for women, of which there were very, very few prior to the war. But I just wanted to, before we move to our next clip, I just wanted to address a couple of the questions that we had here from the chat. So one was, I'll just run through this very quick because, again, we want to give everybody all of our wonderful interviewees time here. But one is just a little bit of background on what was happening at the yard. So just to give you some context, there were about 72,000 people that worked at the Navy Yard during World War II. We repaired about 5,000 ships. It was arguably the busiest shipyard in the world. Of that 72,000, about 10,000 of them were women, and about 5,000 of those were women in production jobs. So working like the women we've heard from so far, as welders, as ship fitters, things like that. And then we also had an upswell in the number of African Americans that were working at the yard. So that was another kind of transformative moment. And the yard created opportunities for people, but those opportunities were often very, very circumscribed in terms of the type of work and the type of advancement and opportunities that they were able to do. And so what it did was it brought people together who maybe wouldn't have had the opportunity to interact in their normal daily lives in Brooklyn. And it brought people from all over the city and all over the region. And so that brings us to our next person, which is Lucille Ford. So I'll bounce it back to you, Amy, to tell us a little bit about Lucille.
Yeah, so Lucille Ford was an African-American woman who worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, first as a messenger and then as a clerk typist. She grew up in Harlem and the Bronx, and she graduated from Wadley High School. She worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard from 1942 to 1945, and one of the things she talks about a lot in her interview is the friendships she made with the women who worked at the Navy Yard. In particular, she talks a lot about meeting people of different races and religious backgrounds. And just for some context, this oral history interview occurred on December 11th, 2007, and Lucille is approximately, I'd say 85 years old at the time of this interview.
And as far as I know, Lucille is still with us. One
Yes.
thing you'll notice on all the slides is that we have their birth and their death date, and many of the participants in this project are no longer with us, but some of them are still around. So let's listen to Lucille talking about her experience.
One girl was it was a Jewish girl and an Italian girl. Oh, Frances. She was another one of my friends, and she was very curious. And she said she had never been to Harlem, so I said, "Why don't you come and visit me?" So she said, "Good." I said, "What kind of food do you like?" She said, "Tell your mother to cook anything." We were in the Bronx. It wasn't Harlem. It was in the Bronx. And she says, "I've never tasted greens." So my mother made greens, and of course she didn't have the pork chops with it, but she had something else with sweet potatoes.
So she was Jewish.
Yes.
Okay. How was it? Was it fun? Did she enjoy
Oh yeah,
herself?
she was very nice, and she was newly married. Okay. And she told. Oh, we did talk. We did talk because she told us, "Are you over age? I mean, how old are these girls?"
So there are these little moments just about life, and I wonder if Mary and Amy, since you spent so many countless hours with these people, with these stories, what were there any things that kind of surprised you or jumped out at you from some of these stories that have stuck with you?
Before not
sure,
to cut
Sadie,
off
yeah, go
Mary
ahead.
and Amy, but this one is so resonant for me because I have
please.
to say, as the lead interviewer for this project in the 2000s, early 2000s, there's a few themes that really stay with me, and definitely hearing the voices of people, I can be right back in that room with many of them. And a lot of these people are also people who, it's really interesting, the process of it's such a deep and personal and broad and powerful to listen to someone's oral history and to record it. And a lot of those really stay with me very deeply and personally. And one of the things that I took away from this project, doing the number of interviews that I did, was that the Brooklyn Navy Yard time during World War II was, for so many people in New York City and in Brooklyn in particular, this really great opportunity for them to actually form more close relationships with people that were different from them in terms of race, ethnicity, religion. And so many people, and Mary and Amy, you have listened to these more recently than I have, but my memory is that a lot of people would have comments of, my neighborhood was all Italian, or my neighborhood was all Black, and this was the first time I was meeting, actually being friends with someone who was Jewish. And so that's what we hear from Lucille Ford here, is a theme that really resonated in a lot of the stories of actual deeper relationships forming where people had before kept to their neighborhoods. The Navy Yard allowed for more mixing on a deeper level.
That actually reminds me of, and I'm not remembering what interview it was, but some guy talking about how anybody even off your block was not really your neighbor. You stuck so hyper local as a kid growing up in the city. So you're right. This was a total opportunity for them to sort of see off the block.
Yeah.
And of course, it drew people from all over the country as well. People, coming for all the industrial jobs that were available in New York City. And especially, I think we have a couple of people in the collection, who came from the South. So it's also, part of the Great Migration as well. Great. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I just wanted to mention real quick. We have a few people mentioning, that they had relatives who worked or served in the yard at different points in time. And someone asked about getting employment records. we don't really have them at the Center for Brooklyn History or at the Brooklyn Navy Yard Archive. When the yard was closed in 1966, those records were all taken by the federal government. So you can request them. I'll just add, though, unfortunately, many of those records, especially from World War II, were destroyed in a fire at the National Archives in St. Louis. So it may be hard to find some of those. But the collections that we do have that are related to employment records, they're ones that people have they've donated to either to the Brooklyn Navy Yard Archive or to the Center for Brooklyn History, and that's a nice segue to our next artifact that we're going to talk about, which is this incredible collection of letters from Lucille Kolkin that she sent, as Amy mentioned before. She's sending back and forth with her husband Al. And so we actually have a little, we won't make you read all of this cursive right here, but we have a nice dramatic reading that was done by Martha Gunther, who Mary asked to do this, and she's a teacher at PS 116. And so we'll just listen to this letter.
Yesterday, Minnie, a Negro tacker who has been in the yard as long as I and interested in becoming a fitter, became disgusted and signed up for welding school. Another victory for Hack and his ilk. Poor gal, she hates welding and is all upset. She knows she's not doing the right thing by giving up the fight, but she insists there's nothing else to do. Hack told her welding is a fine idea. A couple of Negro girls and I were trying to talk her out of it. But she persists in the idea that not only does she have to fight as a woman, but as a Negro. She was practically in tears. I don't know how well we convinced her to remain, but I'll soon find out. The gal really has wonderful ability and potentialities. She's a former teacher and math genius, and gee, Butch, it's such a goddamn shame.
And so we chose this letter because you can really hear that intersection, of gender and of race, and those unique challenges that Black women had, and there was not an insubstantial number of them. When we talk about the first women coming to work in production jobs in the yard, which is in the summer of 1942, 10% of them were Black women. So it's so not only do we get this insight into from these letters into Al and Lucille's experiences, but also talking about these other people. So I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else about this letter or about the collection of letters. So I wanted to show one more little detail. This is one of my favorite little things. So the letter collection was also of the Kolkin letter collection was also something that was very, very influential and very much incorporated into Jennifer Egan's work on Manhattan Beach. And so we find these little details in there, like this kiss and love and pinch. Some of the letters get pretty racy. We didn't show the one that actually has lipstick on it from Lucille kissing it, but yeah. Sadie, you want to add something?
Yeah, just that I have great memories of Lucille's husband being in the beautiful library of Center for Brooklyn History, and seeing her letters archived there. And I know that it's just amazing to meet people. She had passed. I wasn't able to meet her. She passed in the 90s, but to meet her husband, and she's so lively in her recording and in her letters, and then to meet him, and just that love persists. And it really is one of those memories that I have of this whole experience, was to see an elder holding the memory of their spouse and their spouse's archives. And we should all be so lucky.
Yeah, and we'll talk about a couple other examples, people that I had the opportunity to meet first through oral histories, and then, got to meet them in person. And so this is the next one. And this is, our first veteran. Well, I should say, Al Kolkin was a veteran. He was serving in the military while Lucille was working, first in New York and then out in Oakland. But Robert Hammond was he was in the Navy. And, we talked about how, people were trying in whatever way they could to contribute to the war effort, but they had their work, or their opportunities circumscribed. And being Black enlisted in the Navy, that certainly was the case. Robert actually joined the Navy when he was just 17, and he got the opportunity to be one of the first hospital corpsmen. So that was his rating. So your rating is like your job in the Navy if you're enlisted. And so prior to World War II, African Americans were really limited in the types of ratings they could get. The vast majority were stewards' mates, they were cooks, they're basically doing the cooking and cleaning on ships, or they were limited to really dangerous, physically laborious jobs like construction battalions and ammunition handling. But Robert got this tremendous opportunity to work as a hospital corpsman, and he came to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and actually worked in the Naval Hospital. And so he's going to describe a little bit of what his oral history is extremely long and so rich with detail, but this is one little detail that has really stood out for me since I heard it 10 years ago or more.
After a couple of weeks on the ward, we were sent over to surgery, and we learned surgical duties over there. And this is when I found out that the Navy segregated blood. 1 X on a pint of blood was for white, 2 X's was for Black, 3 X's was for Native American, Hispanics, 4 X's was for Oriental. Now, blood is divided into A, B, AB, and O blood. And that's a blood type. Everybody has one of those types. It's not segregated by racial distinction. And one day, I'm in surgery with a doctor, and they needed some A blood. They sent me down to get a bottle of A blood. He was operating on a white patient. I went down, I brought back a pint of blood, A blood, that had 2 X's on it. I didn't know about those X's then. And I gave it to the nurse. And she looked at it and dropped it on the floor. And it broke. And the doctor told her, "What did you drop that for?" She says, "You can't give that man a Black man's blood." So the doctor said, "Go down there and get me another bottle of A blood and make sure it's got 1 X on it. We can't afford to break blood around here." So I went down and brought it back up.
So, not only were the entire armed forces segregated, even the blood was segregated. I think it's also important to mention that Robert is someone who actually talks a lot about his identity, and he had a multiracial identity, both Black and white and Native American as well. And so again, this is one of my favorite oral histories, and I actually had the opportunity to meet Robert because he actually came to the opening of the Brooklyn Navy Yard Museum back in 2011 when Building 92 opened. We're gonna jump ahead to another one, unless anyone has anything else to add about Robert. But we're going to jump ahead to one. If you've ever been on any of our tours of the Navy Yard, or you visited the Brooklyn Navy Yard Museum and listened to the oral histories we have in the museum there, this is probably a name that you've heard before, which is Carmela Zuzza. And you also mentioned, Sadie, when we were preparing for this, that Carmela's story is one that has stayed with you all these years later.
Definitely. Carmela is someone who I think of often, and it's interesting. It's it's not so much the details of the stories that she shared, but her spirit with which she shared them, and her spirit at all facets of her life, talking about herself as a young woman sort of first leaving her, pretty protected Brooklyn neighborhood, and all the way to being an elder when I was interviewing her. And we had some really great conversations, some of which are on tape and some I think were after, about just navigating the ups and downs of life that have really stayed with me. And I'm very grateful that I was able to meet her.
And we have an image here of Carmela when she came to visit the Navy Yard for the first time since she left in 1945. She came actually on her 90th birthday, and she did a tour with some of my colleagues here. I wanted to ask a question to Amy or to Mary, which is that, most of these people in the collection are talking about things that they did when they were 17, 18, 19 years old. What was it like listening to that and just trying to imagine basically being a teenager with some of the experiences that they describe?
It was so, there's so many ways I can answer that. Some of them, you can really tell that it feels far for them. Like, you ask Audrey, how did you take night classes and work all a 60-hour week? And she's just like, I don't know. But other people, it sounds, there are certain things that just stick in their heads as if they were yesterday. And Carmela's definitely one of them. She has very detailed memories in her interview about, her parents grew all their vegetables. Her mom made beer in the basement in Brooklyn, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and certainly the clip we're going to listen to right now is something that stayed in her memory, as well as the memories of many of the people in the collection. And that is the arrival in April 1945 of a ship called the USS Franklin. And we'll listen to the clip, and then we'll give you a little bit more context about the Franklin if you're not familiar with this incident.
It was a sad time.
Yeah. So you mentioned before that when the Franklin came in, that it had been battle damage.
Oh, yeah.
And so that wasn't, you weren't.
No, I didn't. But I worked on parts of it. They brought it in the shop when they got the metal.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like repairing. We did repairs too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's asking me about the Franklin. It was bombed. I told him what happened in the shipyard, that they said I wouldn't go in there. Mm-hmm. They were taking the body parts off. They came into the Navy Yard like that. Mm-hmm. Awful. Mm-hmm. A lot of boys got killed in that.
Mm-hmm. So again, for context, the USS Franklin was an aircraft carrier that was operating about 60 miles off the coast of Japan in March of 1945, and it was hit by a bomb from a Japanese plane, and it absolutely devastated the ship. More than 700 men were killed, and they brought it to Pearl Harbor. It stayed afloat. They brought it to Pearl Harbor and realized they didn't have the capacity to fix it there, so they took it through the Panama Canal and brought it back to Brooklyn. And this is the condition that it was in when it came here. And so this is an incident that first of all, the ship suffered a greater loss of life than any other U.S. ship in the war, except for the USS Arizona, incidentally also built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But it was also, to see these battered ships coming in. This is something that really kind of, brought the war home to people in New York, even though the battlefronts may have seemed so far away. Sadie, Carmela just references there's somebody else in the room with her in that clip. Could you tell us a little bit about who that was?
Yeah, her husband, and he was feeling very emotional at hearing us begin to talk about this story. And at the time of our interview, he had Parkinson's, and at the time of our interview, that was pretty far along for him. And so, he was maybe harder to understand because of that, which is why he maybe didn't join us for more of the interview, but but he was definitely present and listening, and obviously felt strongly about his memories of this time.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely something that, again, that emotion comes through in not just their oral history, but the oral history of several other people that are in the collection as well, when speaking specifically about the USS Franklin. So, but speaking of people of advanced years who are in the collection. The next clip we're going to listen to is from Wesley Fagan, and you can see that he lived to be 102 years old, and he actually did this interview not too long before he passed away. So
yeah,
Amy,
I think
can you
he was
tell?
101
Yeah,
when we interviewed him.
Yeah, and Amy, maybe you can tell us a little bit about Wesley.
Sure. So Wesley Fagan was an African-American man who began working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard as a messenger in the mailroom. And he was born in Portsmouth, Virginia, and lived in Bed-Stuy from the 1950s until his passing. He began playing clarinet as a teenager and took up photography when his father gave him a Kodak box camera. From 1944 to 1946, he was in the Army and played in the Army band in Hawaii and Japan. And after the war, he moved to Brooklyn and began working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard as a messenger. In the 1950s, he became the official photographer of the Brooklyn Navy Yard until the yard closed in 1966. And as mentioned previously, Wesley's 101 at the time of this interview.
Yeah, so it should be relatively clear, but just keep that in mind that he's over 100 years old. And Wesley's such an interesting figure as well, because not only do we have his story documented, but he was the person documenting the yard, for I think 15 years or so, he was the official photographer. So a huge number of the photographs that we have, at least in the Brooklyn Navy Yard archives, are him. So he's someone that kind of also spans this gap between the veterans of the war and also civilians working in the Navy Yard. So listen to him.
When I got out of the service, I went to photography school, Germain Photography School on Broadway under the GI Bill. And I had been doing photography work while I was in the Army because I was in charge of the projector, showing the pictures of the service. And even while I was in Okinawa, I built a darkroom in my company where I did my photography. And I used to do photography for all the areas. For the pilots, used to bring me the negatives and to make pictures of them. Photography has always been a part of my life. And so when I got out of the service, I went to photography school. And from photography school, that's when I went to the Navy Yard. They wouldn't give me a job as a machinist, although was highly recommended on account I had worked in a Buffalo machine gun plant, and I was a machinist there, but they wouldn't give me a job. But at the Navy Yard, they gave me a job as a messenger in the mail room, and I delivered mail to all the shops in the Navy Yard, and an examination for an opening for photographer came, and it was posted on the bulletin board, and they had to give those in the service the opportunity for the job before they applied to the public. So I applied for the job. By fate, for somehow or other, I was selected as a photographer out of several. And I can't remember whether I think why I became number one is after I was at the Navy Yard. At the Navy Yard as a photographer, I had to make up the chemicals myself.
And we actually have a picture of his photography studio right here. So this comes from a wonderful album that is in the Brooklyn Navy Yard archive, showing his studio, which was in Building 77, I believe, which is still standing. But it's interesting there because he talks about facing racial, facing discrimination. He was a skilled worker, he was a skilled machinist, and wasn't able to get a job, and instead had to take a low level job. at the yard. Even after World War II. I do want to make sure we have enough time for questions at the end, unless anybody has anything else they want to add about Wesley. We're going to move on to our last clip that we have here, and again, it's in reference to the post-war period. What happened to all of these people working in the Navy Yard? So in 1945, we have a civilian workforce in the Brooklyn Navy Yard of about 72,000 people. Just as context, that is the largest industrial plant in terms of employment in the history of New York State. So it's absolutely enormous. After the war is over, there's no longer a need for this enormous workforce. And so most of the people are laid off, but that includes basically all of the women, because the women were hired as unclassified employees. So they were hired for the duration of the war plus 6 months. And frankly, most of the people of color that came to work in the yard, they were also unclassified. And part of the reason for this was that people were given these new opportunities during the war, and there really wasn't enough time for people to really develop a lot of the skills for this, the really highly skilled work. And they also weren't necessarily given the same opportunities for training and advancement that other people at the yard and the longer tenured people at the yard were given. But still, some of these people came out to be very, very skilled. And I know a lot of people, especially a lot of the women, we heard at the beginning about people who, weren't so excited about the work and thought it was very hard. But there are people who are in this collection who talk about actually really loving the work and really taking to it. And I think a couple of those people right here are Sylvia Everett and Ida Pollock. So Mary, maybe you tell us a little bit about them.
Yeah, just briefly. So they were buddies from childhood. They both grew up Jewish in the Bronx, but they have really different backgrounds. So Sylvia's dad was a furrier, and she grew up in this very traditional family home, whereas Ida grew up in this sort of communist-leaning cooperative called the United Workers Cooperative Colony. Sylvia finished college. Ida dropped out and had a bunch of jobs that she describes as strange. It includes sorting cards at a greeting card factory. They were both hired at the yard, and they were both laid off when the war was over. So this clip is sort of about Ida's effort to find more work after the war. A little note, I hope this doesn't spoil it too much. I will add that Ida's only chance to use her Navy Yard skills came 15 years later when she was a medical technician at a hospital and they needed a door welded. She was like, oh, wait, I know how to do that.
And we can actually see them in this image here. So we have, this is Sylvia, is that right? And this is Ida. And then this actually is Lucille Kolkin. But let's listen to the clip. So this is actually, they did their oral history together, but this is two clips that are sort of edited together. And Sadie, you've also said that this is one that really has stayed with you all these years later.
Yeah, again, because of the spirit of these women and their friendship, that lifelong friendship is beautiful to see. And when we did this interview, it was Jennifer Egan, Daniela Romano, me, Ida, and Sil. So big group of women in the room having fun.
And I tried to find a job after I had left the Navy. You know, I'm jumping ahead. I'm married and I went up to Boston. I spent a long time trying to find a job. They all thought I came from some insane asylum.
Yeah.
You know, they looked at me like I was a total lunatic. You're gonna weld? That's funny.
But one time when I lived up in Troy for a while, there was an ad in the newspaper for a welder. And just for the hell of it, I called. And there was dead silence on the other end.
They weren't interested.
No, they weren't interested.
Unfortunately, that was the case for so many women, that they learned these skills during the war. Some of them really like the work. And then that, they didn't have the opportunity really, in most cases, for the rest of their life to ever do this kind of work again. It's something also that Wesley mentioned, which is that priority was given to veterans of the war, and so women were laid off, and then there were way more veterans that the federal government had promised work to than there were actually jobs for, and so women were kind of left out in the post-war economy. So I know we have a bunch of questions here. Yeah, Sadie, you want to add something?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add, because it has such a financial impact on the lives of these women. Ida, when she got the job at the Navy Yard, was earning more money than her father was making. And she wanted to continue as a welder. And I don't know the way the class works in the skilled trades, but you're a welder level 1, and then 2, you can go up the ranks in the skilled trades. And she had gone up the ranks and definitely would have stayed, would have wanted to stay welding for a while at such a good, lucrative job if it had been available. And like we heard, just other companies, even though these women had the skills, just did not think it was actually a realistic thing to hire a woman at that time, which you can hear in talking to them. Just the feeling of backlash and the feeling of, oh good, here's an opening and then that door closes, and which it's interesting to see in this time the sort of sparks of our next social change movements, civil rights movements, feminist movements. So anyway, that one sticks with me a lot.
Yeah, and of course, when we're talking about the experience of African Americans experiencing, for many people, experiencing really severe segregation. Some people experience it for the first time in the military. Most people did their training someplace in the Deep South, and also the fact that here in New York City, there were all of these jobs, there was all of this opportunity, there was all this new housing being built, and a lot of people were being excluded from that. So really many of the seeds of the civil rights movement started in this experience that people had, whether in their hometown or somewhere elsewhere in the country or somewhere across the world, had a big influence. I wanted to just address a couple of the questions here. We got a lot of specific questions about people's families and personal stories, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I'll interrupt real quick and say, for those questions, you can definitely email the Brooklyn History Library. We love those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can shoot me an email as well. You can reach me at andrew@turnstile-tours.com. But Lewis has a question here. It said, did these kids, these young people come into work in the yard, 17, 18, did they do the jobs for patriotism or because they needed the work, or both? What if anyone has any kind of insights from what they've heard in the collection?
I came across both, certainly. Audrey, I know, who we listened to first, Audrey Lyons, her father's business had just closed, which was why she went to work. Memi, was very motivated by patriotism. I think she also needed some work. So.
Yeah, and I know Carmela also, her father was ill and her brothers were in the service, so she was also working to support the family. And in many cases, these young women got jobs, and they right off the bat were making more money than their fathers were. Which is amazing, even though in many cases the women were making half what their male counterparts were making in the same jobs in the yard. So that's something, as you were saying at the very top of the program, Sadie, about labor history, that's definitely something that they talk a fair amount about in Ida and Sylvia's oral history about, the unionization and, fighting for equal pay.
Yes, that is a great, was wonderful to hear from them, particularly with Ida's childhood, as you had described, Mary. And they actually sing Sticking with the Union together at one point, and it's great.
We also had a question here from Keith. I think I can answer this question. He said that he heard about people working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard making sporting goods equipment during the war. I have a guess that they may be referring to the Brooklyn Army Terminal, where they did make and package sports equipment. Oftentimes you find that a lot of the military history of Brooklyn and even of New York City kind of all gets agglomerated, all gets put on the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But, during World War II, there were, 40 shipyards. There were a dozen embarkation points. There were hundreds and hundreds of factories just in Brooklyn that were working for the war effort. So oftentimes people just immediately associate anything related to the war effort with the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but it's not always the case that it's the same place. So, yeah. We also had a question about the Hawaiian Steamship Company and where it was located in Brooklyn during the war. We'll have to look into that one a little bit more. And then we also had someone who asked about the East River bridges. I know this is something I know a little bit about. I can't remember if anyone mentions it in the oral histories, but the fact that the bridges were actually kind of covered in these canvas shrouds, and they had guards on them. And, if you've ever gone over the Manhattan Bridge or the Williamsburg Bridge on your bike or in a car or on the subway car, you get a really nice view down at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So they were trying to deal with that. So security, people, there are some great moments we weren't able to share today about the security at the yard, most specifically about how the workers actually experienced, having to go past the Marine guards every single day. One of them, I'll just give a plug to one of the oral histories in the collection, which is Anthony Ferrara. If anyone wants to share a little bit of Anthony's story.
Amy, you wanna?
Well, I from what I remember is there were a lot of questions about what was it like to walk by the Marines that were stationed there. And then some people were just like, oh, it was just something you had to do. And people were like, yeah, you had to like open up everything and show whatever you had to whoever was stationed there. And it was part of the routine, but that was the whole security of it was also a reminder, I think, of reminding people like, hey, you're in wartime. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah. And he talks about how they couldn't have any alcohol, at the yard. And so any workers that came in with thermoses, the Marine guards would open them up and they would smell inside to see if there was any alcohol. And Anthony talks about how he resented in the wintertime. He would just watch the Marines sniff it and their noses would drip into his coffee and have to pour it out. So again, those little details are just so amazing. But yeah, so we're just about out of time. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us, for your great questions. We could do this all evening. I want to thank Marcia and Bo behind the scenes, and everybody at the Center for Brooklyn History and the Brooklyn Public Library. Thank you, of course, to all of these people and their families who participated in the Oral History Project to make this amazing collection a reality. And thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for giving us so much insight, not only into these people's lives, but into the process of creating this amazing collection. So yeah, anything anybody wants to add before we sign off?
Just that these are really cool to listen to. I just jump in and poke around. They're really fun.
Yeah.
One I did listen to, Don Condrell, is really fun. He was like a during World War II, and he was just running around the neighborhood collecting stories.
Yeah, and that's one too. If you don't have to necessarily be interested in the Brooklyn Navy Yard to really dig deep into these oral histories, and Don Condrell, that's one where he gives such kind of vivid description of the whole neighborhood around the yard. Yeah, that's a great one, Mary. Thank you.
Yeah, I think some of my favorite parts of these interviews were like the details people had about their neighborhoods and like the neighborhood changing over time. And it's a really amazing collection to just kind of track how Brooklyn changed.
Yeah. So again, thank you to Mary and Amy and Sadie. This has been really wonderful and so nice for me to also kind of go down memory lane with so many of these oral histories. So again, thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night, and thanks again.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Mary.
Oh, actually, before we go, I got to pull up one more slide so that you can see a little bit about some more about the collection. These were all the people that we listened to. And again, we dropped the links into the chat, but you can also just go to brooklynhistory.org and you can find the oral history portal, not only the amazing Brooklyn Navy Yard collection, but all of the other collections that have been digitized and are accessible to anybody. So again, all right, thank you so much.